Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Status Quo and Rockin' All Over the World. That was the song that opened Live Aid. Who can forget? Well, joining us on the line now is Paul Vallely. He was covering the 1984-85 famine in Ethiopia for The Times when he and Bob Geldof first met. Inspired by his on-the-ground reporting, Geldof asked him to travel across Africa with him in 1985 to help decide how to spend the £140 million raised by Live Aid. He co-wrote Bob's best-selling autobiography, Is That It?, and worked as Geldof's advisor on the Commission for Africa, which laid the groundwork to lobby world leaders to double aid to Africa and cancel its debts. His new book is Live Aid, the definitive 40-year story from pop and poverty to politics and power. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. That Rockin' All Over the World brings back memories because when it was played, Bob was in the royal box with then Prince Charles, now King Charles, and the king or the prince leaned over to him and said, "Hey, what is this? Who are these chips? And Bob said, "Oh, this is Rockin' All Over the World. They are quintessentially rock and roll with the denim and the long hair and the 12-bar blues. This is what it's all about." "Oh, yes, I see," said the king. Yeah.
Oh,
whenever I hear that now, it reminds me of that.
Oh, brilliant. Great memories. Your head must be full of amazing memories like that.
My head is full, and so is this book, actually. It's extraordinary. I've been working with Bob for 40 years now, and I've been kind of hoovering up all these experiences and stories with him meeting top pop people, top rock people, top politicians, presidents, prime ministers, popes. And, the book, some of the stories in the book obviously have been told before, but a lot of them haven't. They're very fresh. And this is like 40 years experience poured into one volume.
Oh, amazing. And just going back to that moment when you first met in the mid-'80s and he asked you to travel to Africa with him, what were your thoughts? I mean, what did that mean to you at the beginning?
Well, I'd been in Ethiopia filing almost daily reports to the Times. I've been there for about 6 weeks when I got thrown out of the country by the Ethiopian secret police because I'd reported that there were cholera outbreaks in the camps, and they were denying it. And that meant that the medicines and equipment that you need to deal with cholera, which is a deadly disease, you die within hours if you get it, they were not providing it because they didn't want to admit they've got cholera. Because if you've got cholera, then you can't export food. And one of the ironies of this great famine in which 1 million people died was that the Marxist regime in Ethiopia were exporting cattle to Yemen at the same time as their own people were starving. And so they decided I was, as they put it, an enemy of the revolution, and they threw me out. And what I didn't know was that Bob was reading all this stuff, and it was really shaping his thinking about it. And there are several instances in the book where you see that it was directly because of my reporting that Band-Aid took a particular line. And he contacted me and said, "I'm going to go across Africa," because Band-Aid raised money for Ethiopia, but Live Aid raised money for Africa in general. And so we started in Mali, which is where Timbuktu is, in the east of Africa, and went across under the Sahara Desert all the way along to the west and to Ethiopia. And in each place, Bob collected together all the aid agencies and said, you know what's going on here. Tell me the 3 most important things that need fixing.
Wow. And £140 million is a lot of money. It certainly was back then. But I mean, it's easy to assume that it must have gone really far and changed the life of so many people. But I'm assuming maybe it didn't. I don't know. How was the money spent?
Well, the money was spent on all the basics that you'd expect: food, emergency shelter, medicines. But what happened when Bob was engaged in spending it was that he went to Africa, and he saw there were problems with, like, the people who controlled the trucks were forming a cartel and jacking the prices up. So he thought, right, well, we need to get our own trucks. And that was what made him decide that Band-Aid wasn't enough, Live Aid needed to be done. But then after Live Aid, he realized that raising 140 million was the same figure that Africa had to repay the Western countries in debt repayments every week. So all of that money, it was just like a week's worth. And he realized that what was needed was political action, which would change the relationship between poor countries and rich countries. And so he moved in my book, previous book I've written, I called it A Journey from Charity to Justice. And that was something that Bono went on as well. And they got involved in looking at debt and the politics and started lobbying world leaders. And that was what led to Make Poverty History and Live 8. The concerts at Live 8 were done because Bob and Bono thought the politicians were not taking any notice of the mass movements of people, and pressure needed to be put on them in a different way. And so they had these eight countries in the G8, the world leaders in the most rich countries, those 8 countries. Bob decided to have a concert in each one of them at the same time. That was Live 8.
Yeah. And the politicians couldn't and didn't ignore that, did they?
No, the aid, the millions that had been raised in Live 8 turned into billions in Live 8. And aid was doubled from 25 billion a year to 50 billion a year. And a lot of the debts which countries couldn't repay were wiped away. And there was a hope for some action on fairer trade, but that really didn't come about at that point. But what was interesting, that people don't know this, is that Bob and Bono spent the next 5 years chasing those politicians round the globe, meeting them at every possible opportunity and saying, OK, you promised all these things when you had your meeting in Gleneagles in Scotland, but you've written a check. Where's the money? And they just kept at it until the money was paid.
Wow, amazing. I bet a lot of people don't know that.
No, there's loads of stuff in this book that people won't know. All the ins and outs of the politics, how Bob had to deal with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and how both of them were keen on doing something for Africa, but they were also fighting each other all the time. You know, Brown wanted to know when Blair was going to stop being prime minister and give him a go. And so we had to negotiate very delicately the relationship between the two men to make sure that we didn't kind of end up in one camp or another. And it was immensely complicated. All of that is in the book, but so are all the great stories that people don't know, like about how Harvey Goldsmith set a trap for somebody who was leaking material by announcing in the office that the Spice Girls were coming back together. And he announced it, or got his wife to announce it, actually, in front of this person who was leaking. And the next day it was leaked. It wasn't true. The Spice Girls were never getting back together. But there were lots of stories like that. The stories about would the Beatles get back together? All of that's in the book, as well as all those great stories about how he got Pink Floyd to come back together, and how he blackmailed Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend to bringing The Who into it. And there's a great story that nobody's ever heard before about how Pete Townsend and Mick Jagger wanted to form a band, but they wanted to be on last. And Paul McCartney was being on last because Bob had already promised him that. And there's a great story about how Bob gets home at 2 a.m. after a long day organising all this, and the phone rings, and it's Pete Townsend. Then it rings again, and it's Paul McCartney. Mick Jagger sending messages, and they're all kind of trying to outdo each other. And there's a great story that you must read about the greatest band in the world, how it was on the eve of being formed and it never happened.
Oh, wow.
Chock-a-block with stories, this book.
I mean, anyone who's ever organised any kind of event knows how difficult and complicated it is, dealing with all the different people that's involved, all the mechanics of it all the politics of it all from a social level, I mean. But, I mean, he organised two of the largest events the world's ever seen. And what you've just told us there is an insight into how unbelievably strategically complicated the whole thing would have been.
Yeah, that's right. Prince Charles said to one of his friends afterwards, after he'd met Geldof, he said, that man should have been a general, because it was such a complicated thing to organise. But as you say, they were the biggest events in human history.
Yeah.
2 billion people. And if you had in the radio audience who were listening, 3 billion people. I mean, it was like, half the people on the planet. were being, corralled by this one man, this force of nature, Bob Geldof. He's the human bulldozer. He can get anything done. Amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, did the politicians always take to him? I imagine that some of the politicians around the world might think, who's this guy? Who's this musician coming in and trying to tell me how to do my job? I'm sure he must have put some people's backs up.
He did. He certainly did. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, said to him once, "Don't you talk to me like that." But she's very much kind of in Germany. She was called Mum because she was very mumsy, but also very kind of matriarchal. And she told Bob off. But by and large, I mean, Tony Blair said something about how it was amazing that Bob could get away with talking to people like world leaders like he did. I mean, he would just talk to them like he'd talk to anybody else. And if they were talking rubbish, he'd say, "Hang on a minute, that's just crap."
Yeah,
you can imagine shock around the room.
Yeah,
he did it. He had this kind of fearless streak that he would speak. He would say anything to anybody. And he saw the Ethiopian dictator Mengistu at one point, and Mengistu asked him for £1 million, $1 million. And Bob had heard all these terrible stories about things that he was doing. And he told him to F off in no uncertain terms. And the photographer who was there said even Mengistu could understand the F word when it was 14 times in one sentence. And he actually called him a murderer to his face. Actually, he used the C word. He called him a murdering so-and-so to his face. I mean, he was fearless, Bob, fearless.
Gosh, impressive. And, the fact is, if you're going to take on these world leaders, you need to know your stuff. You need to know what you're talking about. You need to have the facts. And he did.
Yes. Well, one of his other advisors said to him, "Celebrity will get you into the room, but you won't stay there very long if you don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah.
And Bob and Bono formed this organization called DATA, which stood for Debt, Aid, Trade, Africa. And it was a kind of think tank to get some really top brains in to do the kind of analysis that you've just been talking about, so that when they got into the room with the US Treasury Secretary or the German Chancellor, they knew what they were talking about. And if the person, like when Margaret Thatcher said to Bob, Bob said, "What about the European butter mountain? That's a disgrace. That should all be sent out to Ethiopia." And she goes, "Oh, Mr. Geldof," and does this kind of thing about, "Well, butter won't do them much good." And he said, well, butter oil will. She's a chemist. She should have known that. And it ended up with her saying, "Oh, yes, there's butter oil." But in the end, she said, "It's not as simple as that, Mr. Geldof." And he said, "No, Prime Minister, nothing is as simple as dying."
Wow. And there's another story where Bob was forced to write a groveling apology to Bill Clinton. What's that about?
Well, Bill Clinton had done quite a lot of work on debt, one particular kind of debt. And Bono had been there. Bono, of course, had much more leverage in the United States because he was much more famous in America than Bob was. So Bono did the kind of US end, and he got Clinton to do something. Then there were problems with Congress getting it through, and then George Bush came in, and George Bush, it was the opposite of what his public image was. This kind of dozy bloke who couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. He was actually very kind of compassionate about a whole range of things. And his two of his daughters worked in an AIDS hospital in Africa. His wife was very big on girls' education. So Bob and Bono worked this out and knew that if they pushed on the things that were dear to him, he'd come up with it. And he came up with a program to combat AIDS, which was like massive. It's $20 billion or something. It's spent so far, or it did until Donald Trump axed it. And so Bob was asked in an interview when he was out in Ethiopia, about Bush and Clinton, and he said, "Oh, well, Bush is much better than Clinton. Clinton, let's face it, Clinton did F all for Africa." Now, Clinton hadn't done F all, and immediately one of his other advisors said, "Bob, you can't say that." But it was too late. He said it to the journalist. It was in the paper. Clinton got mad and Bob was told, you're going to have to go and apologise to him. And so they went to this party, this socialite party in London where Clinton was, and Clinton was surrounded by this bevy of beauties, and Bob said he couldn't get to him, but I think he chickened out, quite frankly. So afterwards, he was told, no, you've got to write a grovelling apology. And this letter to Bill Clinton began, oh dear, I hate off my heroes.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, love it. And there's also an interesting story about Bob meeting Vladimir Putin on a boat in the Mediterranean.
Yes, Tony Blair introduced them. Bono and Bob were talking to Blair on this boat, which there was a security threat at this meeting of the G8 in Italy. So they moved all the leaders onto this boat, and Putin was there. So Blair introduced them, and Putin was all kind of smiles and for a few minutes, and made some jokes, which afterwards Bob interpreted as jokes about how his attitude to debt was like the mafia. You know, you didn't owe me for very long, and he was all smiles and laughing. There's a video of them actually laughing. But Bob said afterwards he had cold eyes. And he said, I wrote in my notebook, cold and calculating Putin. And so much of what Bob observed came to pass, and the rest of us began to see the world as Bob saw it. Yeah. He's an extraordinary, perceptive bloke, Bob. He's ahead of his time in so many fields. I know a lot of people got cheesed off with him because he was like a bulldozer, a human bulldozer, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. But, you know, he was an extraordinarily effective figure in world history in the late 20th century and the beginning of this century.
Absolutely. I think the world could do with more Bob Geldofs. Definitely.
Well, some people would say one's enough.
No, I get that. Absolutely. Well, if people want to get a copy of the book, it's a great story with so many wonderful stories in it. It's Live Aid, the definitive 40-year story. And there's a foreword by Bob Geldof, which is nice.
Yeah, it is. And he pays due tribute to me, which is very nice, because in real life he's always very kind of bluff and blustery and calls you by your second name and uses rude words. But in the foreword, he said how much he owes to me, and the work that I did put him on the road away from just fundraising for charity into trying to change the politics of the world. And it's very nice that he attributes that to me.
Yeah, lovely. Well, the book is available to buy on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Paul Vallely, who we've been chatting with today. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been fun.